My name is Jacqueline, I'm 38 years old, and I'm still single. In my parents' house, where I have lived since my youth, time seems to have stopped, and every day turns into one endless cycle of obligations and expectations. When I was 20, I dreamed of getting married, like many young women my age, but now this desire seems like a distant, almost unrealistic dream. There are several reasons for this, but one of the most significant is my poor health. I do not suffer from any serious illness, but minor ailments do not let me go. Frequent colds, weakness, and endless bouts of fever make me stay in bed longer than I would like. These incessant illnesses make it impossible to work fully, and even with part-time work, I have to take many days off because of sudden deterioration in my well-being. So I gradually started working from home, which significantly reduced the workload associated with traveling and long hours on my feet. However, this state of affairs has strained our family relations. My mother, who I live with, doesn't seem to understand my condition. For her, my constant presence in the room seems to be something strange, even suspicious. She thinks that I lock myself in four walls unnecessarily, and this irritates her. But how do I tell her that I'm really just trying to cope with my illnesses and keep my strength up? I understand that it is hard for her to realize that I, her adult daughter, cannot work full time, but I am grateful that at least I do not need to look for housing. I live in my family's house. However, it doesn't get rid of the feeling that I'm somehow letting her down. Although I pay all utilities and property taxes, take care of the costs of repairing the house, as well as a significant part of the products, my mother does not stop expressing her dissatisfaction. She often gets sarcastic when she sees that I'm not getting out of bed again or skipping work. She doesn't say it directly, but there is a question in her eyes. How long will I stay in this house? Why did my beloved Eileen leave this house, and you, who doesn't matter, are always here? These words, uttered by my mother, seemed intended to penetrate into my very heart. Over and over she said it, wanting me to hear it, to hurt me. Eileen, my younger sister, has always been the epitome of the ideal for her. 3 years younger than me, she had everything that I never seemed to have: good health, a beautiful face, and brilliant academic success. My mother was proud of her in a way she never seemed to be proud of me. She could proudly show her to her friends, talk about her achievements at work, and admire her life full of light and prospects. I was always in the shadow of this perfect painting, like a character who didn't fit into the family portrait. Mom never missed an opportunity to compare me to Eileen, as if to emphasize how much less important I was in her eyes. I became an empty place for her, something like an inconspicuous background. And Eileen was her pride, her star. It was all so obvious in the little things, in the way she chose clothes for us, what products she bought, how she talked to us. With Eileen, she was always affectionate, attentive, as if only she deserved this love. She often ignored me, and sometimes even seemed to avoid me. But I didn't rebel, I didn't scream, and I didn't demand equal treatment. Why? Because I had a father. He always found the words to support me, gave me the love that I missed so much from my mother. It was his love that saved me from despair. He was the one who made me believe that I wasn't alone in this world. If it hadn't been for him, if it hadn't been for his kind words and care, perhaps I wouldn't have been able to survive in this house full of reproaches and cold indifference. When my father died 3 years ago, everything changed. Mom lost her footing and started relying on me, which was unusual for her. I began to take care of her, despite my health. I cleaned, cooked, and tried to keep the house in order, although I often didn't have the strength myself. But now that she has recovered from her loss, my help seems self-evident to her. She doesn't thank me anymore, doesn't notice my efforts. Every day she asks, "When will you leave?" Sometimes I think about moving, finding my own life, free from its eternal pretensions. But as soon as she talks about the money that I will have to send home, all desire to leave evaporates. She reminds me that I have to repay her for all the years she took care of me. Hearing this, I feel her words weigh heavily on me. She says that even if I leave, I will still have to come to do household chores. You're not married, you have a lot of free time, she adds, as if my loneliness gives her the right to control my life. Every day, listening to her complaints, I feel my health getting worse. But how can I leave her if she's dependent on me, even if she doesn't admit it? And then one day my younger sister, Eileen, showed up at the house. She brought her 6-year-old daughter with her. I thought she just came to visit us after a long time, to show her face like she usually did. But instead, she made an unexpected statement. From today on, we will live here. I could barely hide my surprise. What could have happened? Eileen, with her successful career as a doctor, with a seemingly perfect life? What could have made her come back to this house? What happened? I asked, looking at her in surprise. Eileen replied with a slight grin, as if it was all something mundane. I got divorced. Now my daughter and I will live here. I'm so glad to see you, my mother said with animation, smiling at Eileen. Your face is glowing, and don't hold back, eat properly with your daughter. There was genuine happiness on her face, completely oblivious to my presence, as if I didn't exist in this room at all. My niece, who was sitting next to Eileen, continued to chew in silence. Her eyes seemed tired and sleepy. This scene was frighteningly familiar, an echo of the past, when my father was on another business trip, and my mother was left alone, becoming a completely different person. Then, as now, it was as if my mother had deliberately used my father's absence to ignore me. She only talked to Eileen at the table, as if my chair was empty. Remembering this, I felt tears welling up in my eyes, as if old wounds had reopened. A wave of pain and loneliness swept over me. I got up, deciding that I needed to go out and buy something for dinner, because the food that I had prepared for myself and Mom was clearly not enough now. A feeling of déjà vu came over me. How often in the past, when I still had money, I went alone to buy food and not sit in a painful atmosphere of family resentment and silent contempt. Outside, the evening air seemed heavier than usual. I walked slowly, lost in thoughts of my father, how much I missed his love and support. Tears were streaming down my cheeks, but I didn't try to stop them. There was still a fear inside me of losing the only person who truly cared about me. Now he was gone, and life with my mother and sister had become something unbearable, despite my force of habit. That's how my new life began, life with Eileen and her daughter. I cannot say that I have ever had serious conflicts with my sister. She has always been a distant ideal for me, which, as my mother inspired me, I had to strive to meet. But I felt like our mother always put her above and me below, with a kind of disdain, as if I were something less important. Now that Eileen has returned home, this dynamic has intensified. She began to see me as someone who had to take care of everything, like a servant. Big sister, clean the room, and I'll work, she said with such indifference that I could almost hear the usual mockery in her voice for both of us. At first, I even believed her words. Eileen, a doctor by training, could really find a job in any hospital. But it's been a few weeks now, and she still hasn't started looking for a job, preferring to lie on the couch or chat with her mom. When I cautiously asked what she was going to do, the nurse replied sharply, with irritation, "There are always vacancies for doctors. You just don't understand how much I worked without rest, so let me relax a little." However, Eileen clearly did not plan to relax in moderation. All the housework, taking care of my niece, paying the bills, all these became my responsibilities. I wish I could break out of this circle for just a moment. Sometimes I thought that Eileen didn't understand that her relaxation and unwillingness to take on at least some of the responsibilities made my life unbearable. She claimed that she would return the money as soon as she started working, but these promises seemed like empty words. I was the only one who paid for everything, both for food and utilities. When I suggested sending my niece to kindergarten to make her duties a little easier, Eileen waved me off. Why? You're at home. You can play with it yourself. So my days went on, full of exhausting duties and the silence that filled the house, when Eileen and Mom talked carelessly, completely forgetting about my existence. I once again felt like that little girl who was being ignored, despite all her efforts to be useful. Sometimes it seemed to me that my life in this house had become meaningless. Why am I here? Why am I doing this if no one even notices my efforts? However, one day, when I asked Eileen about her job search, to my surprise, she announced that she was going for an interview. Her departure gave me a feeling of relief, so rare in recent months. I went back to my room, feeling that maybe a change was finally coming. Opening the newspaper to distract myself, I came across an article that caught my attention. Can this be real? I thought, immersed in unexpected thoughts. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Jacqueline, open the door, hurry up. His mother's harsh voice came from behind the locked door. I didn't even notice how I locked myself in. I just wanted to feel safe, at least for a little while. But now that click of the lock seemed stupid, because I knew that my mother would not stop until she got her way. Reluctantly, I turned the key and opened the door. She was standing in the doorway, her face contorted with anger, as if I had committed some terrible crime. What were you doing? Why was the door locked? Stop it, she screamed. You know that Eileen left for an interview, right? Yes, I know, I replied, barely keeping my voice steady. If you know, then leave this house right now. The words cut through my heart like a sharp blade. I froze, trying to comprehend what was said. Leave? How can she demand that? Why? It seemed that time had stopped, and the world around suddenly became unstable. What do you mean? I asked in disbelief. My mother gave me a look full of contempt, as if I didn't even deserve an explanation. Don't make me say it again. Go away. She repeated in an icy voice. It took me a few moments to realize that this was actually happening. My own mother tells me to leave the house I grew up in, the house where I endured years of neglect and loneliness. I mustered up the last of my courage to ask a question. Why? Don't you need me anymore? My mother grinned with that arrogant look I knew so well. You're taking it too slow, Jacqueline. You're always at home, using your health as an excuse not to work. What are you doing for us anyway? You're only pretending to help, but you're really useless. Every word hit me like she was pulling the last of my strength out of me. Everything I did, all my efforts, sleepless nights, days spent chores around the house, even when I felt bad, all this turned out to be insignificant for her. In her eyes, I was just a burden. I work from home, I said quietly, trying to contain my emotions. I invest money and do household chores. People who are useless are no longer needed in this house, was her verdict, cold and final. These words struck me to the core. I stood there, unable to object, realizing that my role in the family was now insignificant. The mother continued. As long as Eileen is here, we don't need you. I'm not going to support you with money, so leave right now. I felt something inside me break. The walls that I had been building around myself for years collapsed, and a cold understanding enveloped me. All this time I hoped that my mother and sister would one day see my efforts, appreciate me. But it was in vain. I finally realized that hoping for their love was futile, meaningless. Okay, I whispered. I'll leave. His father's face flashed before his inner eye. His kind eyes, his soft smile. It was like I could hear him talking. You did everything you could. It gave me strength, as if an invisible hand had gently pushed me to a decision that had been maturing inside for a long time. I wasn't afraid anymore. There was a strange calmness in my soul. It's over. I left this house with the only thought, I will finally be free. My mother shouted something after me that I'd never needed such a daughter, but her words no longer had power over me. I made a decision, and a new life awaited me. without regrets and without clinging to the past. When I found a new place to live, it happened faster than I could have imagined. The apartment was modest, but cozy, exactly what I always dreamed of. After signing the contract, I felt the weight of the past slowly begin to fall off my shoulders. Everything happened so fast that at one point I didn't even have time to realize that this was the day of my move. Finally got rid of the trouble. My mother exclaimed on the day when I was taking the last things out of the old house. Her voice rang with amusement. Eileen added with a grin. "Enjoy your lonely, poor life, Jacqueline. And don't you dare ask for money." I couldn't hear them anymore. I turned around just to say goodbye and walked out the door without another word. My new life turned out to be surprisingly calm and comfortable. For the first time in many years, I felt free. The time spent at my parents' house seemed like a distant dream, some kind of heavy nightmare from which I finally woke up. My health has improved a lot. I was almost not ill, only sometimes I felt a little tired, but it was nothing compared to what I was going through before. Just when I thought my peaceful days would last forever, the phone rang. "Jacqueline, can you help me?" I heard my mother's familiar voice. My heart started beating faster. What could have happened? Unexpectedly for myself, I agreed to meet. We agreed to meet at a cafe near the train station. It's only been 2 months since I left home, but something has obviously happened. I was walking towards the cafe, feeling strangely uneasy. The long streets of the city seemed endless, and my thoughts were confused. Once in front of the entrance, I slowed down, trying to calm my breathing. When I went inside, I immediately saw my mother. She was already sitting at the table, nervously fiddling with the edges of a napkin. Her face was tense, and there was a plea in her eyes. "What's the urgency?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. My mother looked up at me, full of concern. "I need your help," she said in a pleading tone as I sat down across from her. Her face came closer to me, expressing so much fear and confusion that I involuntarily felt more anxious. "Explain it properly," I demanded, no longer hiding a slight irritation. My mother, perhaps surprised by my unexpected determination, suddenly began to cry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her voice became choked. Eileen was terrible. I can't live with her anymore. She lied to me. She said she was going to interviews, but in fact, Mom was choking on sobs, and I sat there, stunned, trying to comprehend what I had heard. "Wait, what do you mean?" I tried to stay calm. "She didn't go to interviews," her mother continued through tears. "She's only been pretending all this time. Eileen was dating a man. She lied not only to me, but also to her husband." My mother's words echoed in my head, and I just couldn't believe what was happening. "Are you saying that she lied to us?" I asked, but the question was actually more rhetorical. Everything seemed too improbable. Yes. She was pretending to work all this time, and instead she was dating another man. The mother replied, sobbing. When her husband found out, they divorced. Now he wants to take her daughter away from her. I sat there, stunned and not knowing what to say. Eileen has always seemed proud and independent to me. How could she ruin everything like that? But she said she works at the hospital, didn't she? I asked, still trying to make sense of what I'd heard. That was a lie, the mother shook her head. She has never worked as a doctor. She was just pretending the whole time. And now, she was left with nothing. Divorce, alimony. She doesn't do anything and doesn't even think about responsibility. My mother's words shocked me to the core. Eileen, my younger sister, whom I always perceived as purposeful and ambitious, actually lived a double life. She hid her true identity, neglecting all duties and morals. And now that everything has become clear, she finds herself in a desperate situation. How is this possible? I barely managed to get out of myself. Didn't her husband know? The mother clutched the napkin in her hands, her fingers trembling. He only found out recently, she said desperately. Everything came out, and now they're getting divorced. He wants to take their daughter away. I couldn't understand how this could happen. After all, Eileen always acted as if everything was under control. But now, what is she going to do? I asked. The mother shook her head, her eyes filled with tears again. She says she has no money and asks me to pay for the legal expenses. But I can't support her anymore, Jacqueline. The pension is small, and the money that your father left is almost gone. Listening to this, I felt a bitter irony arise inside me. My sister, who never helped, always neglected her duties, now wants to blame everything on her mother. And yet she doesn't even think about starting to work. She doesn't even clean the house, the mother continued, sobbing. Her husband didn't know, but she secretly hired a maid, and his money disappeared. It was too much. I couldn't help but laugh. Really? I looked at my mother in disbelief. You did the same thing to me, Mom. You made me do all the housework. My mother waved me off as if my words didn't matter. Don't compare me to Eileen, she replied coldly. What's the difference? I was thinking out loud. Mom didn't seem to notice her own inconsistency. Now that Eileen was in a difficult situation, she turned to me again. She hoped again that I would come back and fix everything. So what does this have to do with me? I asked bluntly. Mom looked at me pleadingly, her eyes filled with tears again. Please come home. When she heard my unexpected refusal, her face contorted with indignation. Mom couldn't believe that I dared to contradict her. That's why you're so merciless, she began, her voice ringing with indignation. I took care of you like a mother should take care of her child, and you are an ungrateful daughter. I listened to her accusations in silence. A whole hurricane of emotions was bubbling inside me, but I restrained myself, just watching as she burst into a furious tirade. Suddenly, my fingers tightened around the glass of water on the table, as if it were the only anchor keeping me afloat. You have no right to refuse me, Mom said forcefully. You must return home immediately. You need to get busy, clean up everything in the house, and don't forget about the money. There's so much to do, so stop complaining and come back. She blurted out the words as if the sound of them could force me to obey. I felt my patience begin to snap, like a tight string strained to the limit. Finally, with a sudden movement, I threw the water out of the glass I was holding right at my mother. It happened so fast that it took me a moment to realize what I had done. For a moment, the cafe was plunged into dead silence. Only the soft sound of dripping water could be heard, like an echo reverberating in the walls of the institution. The mother's face froze in shock. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled with indignation. Sorry, I said with cold calmness. My hand slipped. As soon as she opened her mouth to answer, I threw the water from the glass at her again, hitting her right in her mouth. Mom choked on the words, coughed, trying to say something. Cough. What are you doing? Her voice trembled, but turned back into a cough. Oh, I slipped again, I apologized dispassionately, beckoning the waiter over. When he came over, I used a towel to wipe away the wet spots on the table, then handed Mom a second towel, throwing it on the table in front of her. Why don't you dry off? I looked at her with cold determination. Mom looked at me, bewilderment and resentment in her eyes. What are you doing? I'm all wet. I might catch a cold. She looked up at me, full of indignation. I sighed, not going to hold back my feelings any longer. What does it matter if you catch a cold? I said coldly. Mom squinted, her voice getting louder and sharper. What did you just say? You. Are you crazy? Her scream pierced the silence of the cafe, attracting the attention of several customers. But I wasn't going to give in. For the first time in so many years, I felt that I could express everything that had accumulated inside me. I raised my voice, although I tried to keep calm. "That's enough," I said. "You don't understand that this is exactly what I've always felt. All this time, you've only demanded, controlled, used me like a thing, not caring about my well-being." There was silence in the cafe again. The customers looked at us furtively, and I, no longer paying attention to them, continued. My resolve was strong, and I needed to speak the truth that I had been carrying around for years. When I was little, I had to wash in ice water, I began to explain, looking straight into my mother's eyes. Small towels were the only thing I was allowed to use. Hair dryers were banned, and I was freezing all the time, shivering from the cold. You didn't take care of me even when I was growing up. In those days, when Dad was at home, it was at least a little easier, but when he wasn't there, it was even worse. Mom seemed to freeze, her face was changing, but I continued. "After Dad died, you kept me in this hell. Small towels, no concern for my health. And what did I get? Always ill, always weak. But here's what's amazing, as soon as I started living separately, I stopped getting sick. Not because the stress is gone, although that's too, but because now I don't have to live by your rules." I was silent for a moment, waiting for some kind of reaction. Mom looked puzzled, her lips twitching as if she was going to say something but couldn't find the words. "Are you saying you've been taking care of me all these years?" I grinned, but there was no joy in that laugh. "Did you care?" "No, you controlled me, you used me, but you never cared. You made me do housework even when I was sick. Have you ever thought about my health?" Mom opened her mouth, but fell silent again, unable to find words to justify herself. "Are you saying that I owe you something, that I have to come back and help?" I continued. "I've been helping all these years, so what?" In response, contempt. "That's why I'm not coming back." I knew that the conversation was losing all meaning. My mother's words no longer penetrated me the way they once did, when her opinion seemed the only important thing. Now it was like an echo of the past that had lost its power. I quietly got up from my seat, my movements were confident, almost ritualistic, as if I had known for a long time that this would happen. "Wait, we haven't finished talking yet," she pleaded, her voice filled with despair again. "If we live alone, it's hard. We could live together." I already knew what Mom would say. At that moment, I understood her despair, her fear of loneliness, but it no longer mattered to me. Instead of answering, I interrupted her attempt to persuade me and silently showed her the photo on the phone screen. "What is this photo supposed to mean?" Mom asked in surprise, not understanding what I wanted to show by this. "Take a closer look," I said coldly, narrowing my eyes. "This is a luxury apartment." "So what?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice breaking, but her eyes are still full of skepticism. "This is my house," I replied, and her eyes widened in shock. "What? Your house? You can't afford an apartment like this," she exclaimed, as if it was impossible to believe. I just grinned, enjoying her surprise. "I actually won the lottery," I said. My voice was low, but every word was as clear as a gunshot. She exhaled in disbelief. "You? Did you win the lottery?" I nodded, remembering the day that changed my life forever. I always thought that my life was terrible, that luck was bypassing me. But it seems that God did not abandon someone who lived honestly. "The day you kicked me out of the house, the winning lottery numbers were published in the newspaper." I looked at them and thought, is this really real? Mom couldn't say anything. Her face was distorted with a mixture of disbelief and envy. I was able to buy an apartment with this money. I still have a lot of money left, but I save it and earn it myself. I don't have any worries now, I added with confidence. I'm not sick anymore. I can live and work. In just 2 months, I realized what it was like to live without constant control and pressure. Mom seemed completely confused. She always thought I couldn't do it without her help. And now I was standing in front of her, independent, confident. Therefore, I said, taking a step back, please don't contact me anymore. I'm not going to have anything to do with you or Eileen anymore. I was about to leave when I suddenly felt my mother grab my arm sharply. Her touch was unexpected and desperate. Wait a minute. I'm sorry for everything. Please don't leave me. Her voice was weak and pleading. I looked at her and smiled sadly. Eileen once said that family is just strangers, I said slowly, as if savoring the words. Now you're a stranger to me, too. Goodbye. I pulled my hand away and, without looking back, headed for the exit of the cafe. Mom remained standing there, motionless, with a devastated look. Her world was collapsing, and I was striding forward, gaining freedom. A few days later, my mother called again, this time with a new request. She begged me to let her live with me. I refused, not feeling the slightest pity for her. Eileen also tried to contact me, saying that she was having a hard time with her mom and that I had to help. But I answered her with the same words as my mother. Family is just strangers. Right? Then, without hesitation, I blocked the numbers of both. Some time passed, and I learned from relatives that Eileen is still unemployed, her money has run out, and she spends her days at home without getting up from the couch. My mother doesn't want to take care of the house, and their shared house has gradually turned into a mess. Her niece was taken away by her ex-husband. Mom and Eileen had no money left, and soon they had to sell the family house, which was old and unsuitable for living, and even located in the wilderness, so they got a little money for it. With the money they had left, they moved into a small apartment. But even these modest funds quickly ran out, and my mother began to ask for money from relatives. But by that time, even her closest relatives had disowned her. Now my mother and sister led a lonely and impoverished life, immersed in their barren existence. Eileen still refused to work, as if her pride would not allow her to take this step. As for me, I have completely freed myself from their influence. My health was restored and I enjoyed peaceful days. My work has flourished, and my personal life has become more intense. Recently, a new event happened in my life. Are you considering marrying me? The serious man sitting across from me asked. We had just started dating, but he was already looking at me with deep affection. We were planning to get married next year. With a smile on my face, I looked at the picture of my father on the shelf. I'll be happy, I said softly, and it seemed to me that in a photo he smiled back at me.